Welcome to Communicating Cyber, the series where cybersecurity leaders go beyond the jargon to share the stories, strategies, and real-world lessons that earn trust and gain buy-in for your program. I'm Robin Oldham, founder of Cydia, and I've spent 2 decades helping organizations defend themselves against cybercrime and thrive in the digital world. From advising boards during crises to shaping long-term strategy, I've seen just how powerful the right conversation can be. In each episode, we'll be exploring how CISOs and cyber leaders can tackle one of the industry's biggest challenges: communicating complexity in a way that's clear, compelling, and connects with people. This is your space to learn, share, and be inspired by your peers. Welcoming to Communicating Cyber this week is Phil Clayson, a seasoned CIO with a track record of delivering major technology transformations across industries from telecoms to energy to emergency services and media. Think names like Sky, SSE, and TalkTalk. But Phil's impact goes beyond infrastructure and incident response. He's launched digital products, driven market expansion, and made data work for businesses, not just security. In this episode, we're exploring what it really takes to communicate cyber in the midst of major transformation, when the pressure's high and clear messaging can make or break outcomes. From boardrooms to crisis rooms, Phil brings sharp insight, real-world experience, and a refreshingly honest take on what works and what doesn't. Phil, it's great to have you with us.
Good morning, Robin. Thank you.
Quite a few varied roles in your career history, Phil. What's your journey to CIO been like?
Yeah, I've had a great career. I've been really worked with some great people and been exposed to probably some of the bigger ticket items over the last 15, 20 years. I was part of the team that built Dungeon 2012 with BT on the tech side. So we distributed TV video signals to 100 plus countries for the 4 weeks of the Games and Paralympic Games. I've done a ton of M&A activity, generally FTSE sized acquisitions. So £2.5 billion is the last sort of example. And then found myself doing a bit of M&A work for TalkTalk around about 2014. And we were buying a business that Tesco's was selling. So it was a big gig at the time. And we were head down on that, and then everything changed a bit. So we'll talk more about that as we go through this morning, I'm sure.
I'm sure we will, and that's when I had the pleasure of meeting you for the first time at TalkTalk as well. So, but I think perhaps before we get into the nitty gritty of that, one thing that people might be interested to hear a bit more about is you've been on both sides of the coin, haven't you? Both kind of sending and receiving cyber comms and communications, both as part of a team trying to communicate cyber to an executive and to a board, but also as CIO, kind of receiving from cyber teams. What's your take on the kind of the differences there between sending and receiving cyber comms?
Yeah, you end up. It's a great question. I think you end up being a translation function fundamentally. So you need to understand how to communicate in both directions, and you sort of end up being a message box to a degree, hopefully a useful one. So on the input side, you've got teams of extremely bright cyber qualified people who absolutely know their stuff. They are geniuses in any measure, but not necessarily always the best communicators in a language that the board would understand. And so part of the CTO or CIO, CTO job is to work out what the important messages are, contextualize those in a language the business needs to understand, which generally isn't technical, and translate that up to a board message. And then coming back in the opposite direction, you've got the board not really understanding in some cases. Not that many boards are cyber literate in the way they could be. And there's plenty of examples, even recently, of organizations that have suffered because of that. And then translating that back into the teams to set direction between what is needed by the business and what the tech teams might feel is actually an important thing to be getting on with. And there is obviously a difference. So being a fluid translation function is pretty important to keep everybody moving in the right direction together.
Gotcha. So should we go back to that? I don't know if that sounds too dramatic, but the moment in your career that changed everything, shall we say? What do you want to? We worked together for an awful some pretty long days during that period. Do you want to fill everyone else in on kind of that moment and kind of what happened?
So
2015.
Yeah, it was October 2015. So at the point of this recording, we're going back almost 10 years. Seems a long time ago. And obviously, one would have hoped that the experience that happened to TalkTalk, which was a major cyber breach and data loss, would have hopefully guided big organizations not to have experienced the same in the 10 years that's followed. Sadly, that isn't the case, and that's a fairly safe statement to make. So the
Recording kind of May 2025, and Marks and Spencer's, Co-op, and Harrods have just been struck by cyber attacks in the last 2-3 weeks, maybe. So it's still being described as a wake-up call for businesses by National Cybersecurity Centre.
Yeah, and I think if we go back 10 years, that message was, I mean, the NCC wasn't quite around in the same scale as and completeness as it is today, but even back then, the CEO of TalkTalk was very open, transparent, public about the breach. All the news media outlets were. She spent time with all of them very transparently, and the hope was that others would learn, and obviously some have clearly, but some have still struggled. So the event started. We thought it was a DDoS attack, which happened on a regular basis. Big organizations get hit regularly with these sorts of things. Turned out to be more than that. And over the days that followed, and as you remember, there was a team of people, and they were very long days. We tried to work out exactly what happened when we realized it was more than DDoS, and eventually realized it was a successful cyber attack data breach, and then spent a very, very long time, more than any of us ever imagined, actually fixing the root cause of the problem, both tactically in the immediate term and strategically over a 2+ year period, investing £150 million and having many, many dozens of people working full time on all sorts of cyber remediation. But yeah, that was the event. It was a TalkTalk cyber attack, October 2015. The first big one, probably, certainly in the UK, probably in Europe. The first big one in a telco of TalkTalk's size, and on a brand where people were quite rightly concerned about their private data, but for which there was no playbook. There was no run book back then on how to do those things in a telco. So yeah, TalkTalk was very unfortunate. It did nothing more or less than any other telco was doing at the time. It just was very unfortunate.
Yeah, and I think some of it stemmed back to a very old kind of marketing promotional system, and it was actually a really limited subset of both some legitimate customers and other people that had just put like a name and address and into a competitions thing to win a year's free broadband or a holiday or whatever it might have been. So actually a really limited set of data, but when you've got overlap with a couple of fields and a few of those records that have been given to you check out as being legit customer records, it's quite difficult to kind of unpick in the moment exactly what you're dealing with and the scale of that. You mentioned the kind of the program that followed over the couple of years, and I think you were fairly instrumental in one of the principles for that, which was kind of to turn things off and streamline and deal with the legacy in quite an abrupt way. There was very much a kind of you justify why it still needs to be on rather than that being the status quo. Was there anything there that kind of what led you to that kind of?
Yeah, I think it was. I think we had, we were learning on the job. It's fair to say. We didn't really understand as a business exactly how we were managing technology risk in the sense of specifically in cyber. We understood about resilience, of course, being a resilient network provider. But the cyber thing was definitely a learning experience. I don't think anyone could ever claim anything else. And we had a limited amount of IT asset management information, and I mean at the systems level, not at the config level. And we thought, therefore, we had a starting place from which to go from in those systems that you mentioned. And actually, we looked at the whole IT estate at the time to try and make sure we captured everything. And I remember very clearly, we had this sort of spreadsheet, and it was a couple of hundred or so different IT systems. And bear in mind, as many companies are, TalkTalk was a collection of historic acquisition, around about 13 different M&As, and as you beautifully gestured, built on top of each other. And and that's the way things were often done then. There was nothing abnormal about the way TalkTalk was operating. Others were doing exactly the same. I've worked in companies since that have still not sorted out that macro problem, and it had kind of lost sight a little bit of just how much tech it had acquired over the years. And this spreadsheet that was seen as broadly, the single point of truth was a couple of hundred systems. And then a few people looked over it, people that had been in the business a long time and had built some of these systems going back over many years, even decades. And they were going, well, where's system X and where's system Y and where's system Z? And you realize the sheet was a bit, there was a risk it was incomplete at best.
Mm-hmm.
And so we put an amnesty out across the business because we wanted to capture everything. We had to have a very clear foundation starting point. And of course, when you go to a bunch of engineers who've hidden with some shadow IT and go, please tell us what you built years ago, no one really puts their head above the parapet. Anyway, eventually, when people were given assurances that it was the right thing to do and there was, they weren't going to be fired as a result of having shadow IT, they'd never declared. And, you can imagine the conversations at the time under, as you said in your opening, under extreme pressure, time pressure and public pressure. Eventually, a small trickle of people declared what they'd not necessarily got on the sheet already and should have had. And a couple of hundred or so systems ended up being circa 600 in a matter of 2 or 3 weeks. So it more than doubled. And then it stabilized and we felt we'd got somewhere close to the truth. And from that starting point, we then worked, Robin, with your team and others to figure out what the risk profile was on those systems and then address it on a risk basis rather than on an engineer's personal preference basis. And that, having been through the pain of the initial attack, that was probably the next biggest step we made, was to actually have structure in how to deal with something of that scale.
Gotcha. Yeah, and of course you can only protect what you know about. It's quite difficult to make sure you're defending things if you don't know about them. So one of the questions we always ask early on in engagement is, what are you defending? What are you protecting? It's a bit like lawyers. You can ask 10 people and get 15 opinions. Plenty of scope for having some interesting discussions and actually a useful exercise in getting people on the same page in the first place.
Well, I remember vividly, actually, there was, having got the list, it was kind of useful to have a list of circa 600, which we thought was at least half that originally. And I remember there was an individual on the team, very quiet individual, very bright individual, and he sat in the corner of the room for what seemed like forever, certainly days, maybe weeks, I don't remember now, but it was a long time, seemingly not doing anything, at least not publicly. He was doing something, but it wasn't being declared deliberately or overtly. And I remember thinking, at the time we were all running around like headless chickens and everyone was like full pound. We were working ridiculous hours. It was 7 days a week. It was probably 18 hours a day to start with. Everyone was trying to do whatever they could to help. And there's this very studious individual sat in the corner of the room, seemingly not making as much noise as everybody else. And it turned out what he was actually doing was he was trying to help us risk profile our business in a really meaningful way, in a way that we'd never had before. And in so doing, he was giving us and developing for us very quietly and very diligently. He was delivering for us a risk model that allowed us to categorize various types of risk, especially technology, cyber-related risk, in a way that then allowed us to take these 600 systems and attack them in a sensible, structured way. At the time, we had very little understanding of what he was doing, very little visibility. And then suddenly there was a sort of grand reveal day when he went, well, this is what I've been doing. This is what it means to you. This is how you're going to use it. And almost kind of, show and tell style. Turned out to be immensely useful, but at the time it was like, what's this guy doing for days, sat there quietly doing seemingly nothing, but clearly working very hard.
Very hard, yeah. Has that kind of formed part of your kind of go-to strategy for helping execs understand risk then? That model? Is that something you've repeated in various forms elsewhere?
Yeah, it does. And it led on, it was really interesting. So the spreadsheet we had was 600 or so lines, and there were multiple fields in every one of those records. And the risk profiling that was introduced as a result of this guy doing his studious quiet work added a whole nother dimension, because we had measures of risk on various categories, and we decided to go all in because it was looking back, it was a once in a lifetime technology change project. We just thought we were fixing cyber. Actually, we were building a platform for the future. So we decided to go all in, and we said, well, rather than just look at risk, let's look at other cyber risk. Let's look at other operational risk as well. So we looked at resilience, and we looked at what we called fragility, which was the platform fragile in any way, i.e., the supply didn't exist anymore, or it was limited on the amount of growth it could have from a capacity perspective. And there was a whole number of these things, and we ended up with at least a dozen different measures in addition to pure cyber risk. And we're looking at this data set with these dozen or so measures across 600 different pieces of IT, going, this is a real head challenge. There was no big data lakes as such in those days. Certainly, we didn't have one, so it was all spreadsheet, and we had to try and find a way. It's no good sending an Excel sheet to the board. It goes to my opening points around you're a translation system for them. You're not you don't expect them to crunch data at that level, and so we're trying to find a way to make it meaningful. Yeah. And one of the guys from one of the suppliers on the team came up with this icon, it's sort of an image. And the risk director, who the business did have, but wasn't in any way dedicated or necessarily particularly articulate in cyber on its own, sat in a board meeting and said, this thing looks like a burger. So let's imagine the picture of a burger. And in the middle there was some filling, and then there was a top BAP and a bottom half of the BAP.
Yeah.
Anyway, everyone sort of looked at this, and at the time I thought, let's not trivialize this too much, because this is an important set of data, and you telling us it looks like a burger because you're non-technical isn't really helpful. But actually, it was helpful, and it stuck. And as a result of that, every one of the IT systems was turned into a burger image, a small image, and they were all compiled onto a very large piece of paper.
I remember, I think it was one of those A1 plotters, wasn't it?
It was an A0 plotter.
A0 plotter, yeah.
And at the time, and it was in color. And because there was so much on the diagram, because you got 600 burger blobs, there was not many places in London that could print it at the right resolution. Though I think we found 2 as part of the team. And because it was changing so frequently every day the diagram was then out of date. So it was plotted every single day at immense expense per diagram. So we only had 1 or 2 in the building. And it was biked to us in White City, and it went on the exec wall, and it went on the boardroom wall, and it was used as a comms tool.
I remember it coming out the lift, and it was there on the wall for everyone to see on the way in. That was the status that day, and if I remember rightly, it was grouped by. There was an element of kind of business architecture to it as well. It wasn't just like, oh, there's 600 icons alphabetically. It was kind of grouped around some of the business units and the support systems, and there was a kind of a visual representation of where it was. So there was also an element of holding individual teams to account there as well, as to like, oh, that stuff across the bottom's got lots of red in it, or that block over there on that, who's that? They've got loads of work to do, kind of thing. And it kind of provided, I suppose, in some ways, a bit of gamification around keeping people on it and honest.
It was an amazing visual, and you're right. It was, at the time, it was grouped loosely on our business need. So there was a B2B section, a B2C section, a data section, etc. Today, you'd use a TM forum-like model, and you'd apply that probably to a modern day version. But at the time, that was, again, not really something that was existing.
You'd probably also have some nice big, 4K or kind of 8K TVs or projectors or something lying around that you wouldn't have to have it printed out. But
no, indeed. But it was an amazing tool to translate a message into, and the team that came up with the idea, the lady that called it a burger originally, the team that made it automated from the spreadsheet to the diagram so it could be printed every day, but did an absolutely amazing job. But you're right, it became a guiding light for the business.
The other thing, I think, just to reiterate, because I think some people listening might be like, oh, that seems a bit quaint or a bit cute or something like that. But I think it also highlights the velocity of change that was going on. It wasn't printed daily because, like, oh, well, we'll have a daily update or something like that. And it can seem a bit convoluted to think about printing this enormous picture every day. But it was just a reflection of how hard everyone was working and all the change that was going on. And I think also a really nice way of being able to share that, as you were saying, it was displayed publicly in the office. Everyone could see. It was a reminder for everyone in the business. So you could turn up to work and spend 2 days trying to fix something. And then on the 3rd day, you'd see it update. That thing had changed from red to amber or amber to green or whatever it might have been. And you could also really see the progress that your team were kind of making as you fix things.
Yeah. No, it was. I mean, looking back 10 years ago, it might have been a slightly archaic way of doing it. It was, believe it or not, the most effective way at the time. There was no massive 65-inch screens you could put it on. They didn't exist then back then. So yeah.
Other end of the spectrum, I suppose. Have you ever told a technical story that just completely flopped? You thought you'd got it all nailed on and kind of worked out, and then it just didn't quite have the impact that you were hoping.
Yeah, I think most exec have got so many things plate spinning at once that cyber is just one of the things, and it's to a degree. As you said at the beginning, M&S are the most recent scaled example, but to a degree, some exec go, well, isn't this just a never-ending pot of money? Is it just you're just literally going to just keep pouring money into the cyber pot because it's just getting worse, and AI is obviously exacerbating that another level. So the message has to be very, very carefully carved. In any given year, you probably only get 3 or 4 wins in the material sense with a board. So it's no good rocking up every month for a board meeting and asking for another chunk of money or another project to be prioritized, because there's so much else going on. No one can accommodate that. Whether they should be able to or not is a debate, but they just can't in today's modern businesses. So, probably it's wise to pick one a quarter. And yes, messages will quite easily fail, mostly because if you're presenting a business case, it will have a return. It's very straightforward. It will pass the threshold gate. It will deliver a new product. It will take you into a new territory or whatever. The outcome in principle is very clear because it's tangible, definable, and to a degree measurable. Cyber investment is sometimes harder to validate, because what you're doing, you're buying insurance by investing for hopefully not getting or having a breach in the future, but no one will ever say doing this will prevent you having a breach. It will move you closer to it, but it's an asymptotic style conversation. So
it's 100% secure.
Yeah, exactly. And so people go, well, why would I invest in that over this if you can't offer me a guarantee? Well, because if you don't do it, there's a stronger chance you're going to have a problem. And what's the chance? And how do you put that probability and risk against something else going wrong in the business? And it's a very hard conversation. So you have to. My view would be you have to build a level of trust to say these are 3 or 4 big ticket items you need to do in a year. This will give you better human protection by humans being more aware, which often is where some of the problems occur. It will give you the early warning signals you need if something goes wrong that the humans can't see. And if it does go wrong and the humans don't spot it and the early warning systems fail for some reason, then you've got maybe some investment in order to remediate, do incident management and incident response and so forth more quickly. One of the conversations that's running in the current news as we sit here in 2025 about the cyber attacks that are live that you mentioned at the beginning are one of the big businesses in the UK allegedly had no cyber incident response plan. They hadn't rehearsed it. So whether that's true or not, it's hard to say, but a couple of insiders have come forward and said that appears to be the case. Now, that probably is something that boards can't or shouldn't ignore. They should at least do something in preparation for the day that they potentially get attacked. So messages have to be tuned. Don't go too often with a new ask, and lay the foundation very thoroughly in advance. So work your stakeholder group months in advance of when you want to take something to the board. Have a 12, 18-month ahead plan. Make sure that you're using language which builds to an acceptance over time of what you're trying to achieve. Get the teams around it. Help the teams get comms sorted. To my earlier point on some super cyber people don't always have the best way of messaging a board. And actually think of it as a longer run. You don't rock up with an ask and then you'll wonder, because it will fail. To your point, it will fail at that point.
And I suppose that also gives you, working through kind of over that much longer period, gives you time to refine the message, understand if you've got the language right, and those sorts of things.
Yeah, you can sense test it, you can tune it.
Is there a two things, I suppose. Slight plug. We've open sourced a free incident response plan for organizations to pick up. You can find that linked from our website, because we think everyone should have one. It's the overarching framework. It's not the individual playbooks to a particular scenario, but at least it gives you the kind of overarching bit of how to convene stuff. So hopefully that's useful for folks. Coming back to the kind of the investment piece though. Is there a particular analogy kind of that's helped you win hearts and wallets over the years that you think
Yeah, I mean,
provides that neat kind of translation point, easy for everyone to understand?
yeah, I mean, you got to be careful on that one because you're not, as I said just a minute ago, you're not offering a predetermined agreed return on something. You're essentially selling insurance to try and prevent something, or prevention, even not even insurance, but prevention.
Mm.
Um, if you and your question just sort of earlier was, what backfired, what's not gone well. My experience is when you try and back an exec or an exec team or a shareholder group into a corner by going, if you don't give us this money to do this, you will get. There's a defense mechanism that triggers because execs don't like surprises. First,
Yeah.
they like to know what's coming. They like to understand. They like to be part of the conversation in the most part. So if you back them into a corner, that's a bad idea in many cases. Um, and therefore you have to be very clear on laying the ground case for that. In terms of making the right choices on sort of investments, then again, it's back to the conversation we had earlier on around with the chap who sat diligently very early on in the TalkTalk experience. If you've signed off an agreed risk profile across your business and you've got a methodology and you've got a way of governing it, and everyone is clear that's what you're doing, which takes immense amounts of comms if it's all new, then you get to a point where you can refer back to the thing that they previously have seen, understood, and agreed.
Mhm.
And you can go, well, we discussed back in 6 months
Whatever it
ago,
was.
yeah, before, and this sits in the framework here, and it's less important than the one we did previously because we did that one first, but it's the next most important thing to do. And you can have a conversation, and they go, okay, well, at least this pitch, this business ask, this finance ask is set in a context that has structure and sense. It's not a random ask. And then you've got a little bit more credibility um, in an issue which, as we've all agreed, I think is always a hard sell. You've got a little bit more credibility to then go and say, okay, I need 1 million, or I need this supplier signed off, or I need to do this, or we need to invest in a platform, whatever it might be, right? Or we might need to, run a dry run instant, mock instant. So any of those things, all of which take time out of people's diaries when they're busy doing a million other things as well. So it's got to be set within a very comfortable blanket. So yeah, that's my thinking around some of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. And do you ever use um, analogies to help support that? Is there anything that you found that's useful to aid in that translation, or is it do you keep it more to the like you say, going on a bit of here's the scaffold, here's the framework that we've built around, and this is where it fits within that, or
Yeah, I mean,
any
you can
shortcuts there, or
you can certainly create metaphors based on the business. You can create metaphors that mean
mm,
something, um, and there's some that are generic. So, for example, if you are, and this has happened to me in recent times, if you are asked by an investor to fix something which is they bought business,
mm,
and it's known to be in need of some investment from a cyber perspective, then you can have a simple conversation with the investors who are generally running 4 or 5 investments at once, and they really just want it fixed. They're not particularly interested in understanding the detail. They just want to hear that they've asked you to do something, they've given you the means to do it, and you've done it.
yeah,
And the simple example that most people will relate to, because I'm sure we've all been there, is you can buy a very, very old, battered up, uninvested, not well maintained car, and unless you're a complete idiot, you know that if you buy a really, really cheap car, at some point you're going to have to do something on it, unless you're very,
yeah,
very lucky. And therefore, you put some money into investing in improving your car and making sure it's roadworthy and all that sort of stuff. The other end of the scale, and that will be the business that is underinvested in from a cyber perspective. That's the
yeah,
sort of correlation. The other end of the scale correlates more to a brand new car that you bought straight from a dealer, you paid top whack for with all the premiums, all the warranties, and everything else. And yes, it might still have a problem, but actually you've got cover inbuilt into what you bought. Now, where most companies want to be is that upper end, without
or you
having
want to maintain it at that level
to
because you want to
and then
protect the
maintain
value.
it.
Yeah,
So yeah, you can say to some execs, look, I don't want to be dismissive of what it is you bought or what you've done in the past, but what you've actually got is a car that's got, two ball tires and needs, some shock
Yeah.
absorbers or something, and say this is the price to fix it, and I can get on with it, do it, and this is what happens as a result, and then lay the story out for then you've got a nice tidy car.
Yeah.
Um,
My equivalent kind of car analogy has been that your security controls are people think about preventing you from doing things and preventing attacks, right? On both hands. If you speak to users, it's like, oh, security is the thing that stops us being able to do whatever it was that we wanted to do before that was probably an unsafe behavior, and you're trying, with the best intentions. But they're all kind of often it's preventative things, equivalent to kind of saying, oh, well, it's like slowing us down is what you might hear. Security is slowing us down. But to stick with the car analogy, how quickly would you drive if you didn't have any brakes on your car? If they're the security controls in your business and they give you the ability to drive, quickly and then come to a stop, or to turn left or turn right and pivot when you want to do so in a controlled manner, rather than I don't think you'd have many people driving at 70 on a motorway if they had no way of slowing the car down other than aerodynamics.
It's the education, though, to your earlier question and thoughts. The education of, well, would you drive on a motorway at 70 with no brakes? Some organisations probably still are in that sense, and so the biggest part is not necessarily delivering the change. The biggest part is getting to recognise that you're trying to help. You're not trying to be, progress prevention. And as we all know, if you think about it up front and it's part of as I said, that's why I said the 12 to 18 month rolling window is important. If people know it's coming, then there's less rejection, or there should be less rejection, because people go, well, yeah, okay, we planned this in a little bit. We've done our research. We understand it's the right thing to do. We've done some training, whatever it might be that gets them to the point where they can then do what is needed when the time comes. A lot of organisations get surprised by suddenly having to do a pen test, or get surprised by suddenly having a cyber security framework assessment, and it comes out with a low score, and they go, oh, well, why is that then? Well, because you haven't got a plan. So it is a conversation. Definitely.
And do you think that boards really want to understand cyber, or do you think they shy away from it? Do you think there's a kind of there's been a lot of hype for a lot of years now about it, and probably maybe a disproportionate number of people saying that the sky's falling, or kind of for all the high profile incidents and breaches that there have been, they are still a relatively small proportion of organizations that experience those truly, headline worthy kind of incidents. Do you think there's a desire to understand it, or do you think there's a kind of I think you mentioned earlier they've got lots of things on their plates, it's just one of those kind of pick it up, have a look at it, kind of put it back in the box kind of quickly as possible kind of thing?
Yeah, I think so. I think there is a desire to understand. I don't think any exec member or board member or investor I've ever met point blank refuses to recognise it's a thing that needs to be on the table, along with a million other things, of course. I think the difference with cyber, as we sort of touched on a bit earlier, is other business decisions, non-cyber ones, are things that humans, managers, leaders, exec and boards have grown up with over their career. You learn to manage a budget. You learn to do a product plan. You learn to do an operational plan, whatever. No one generally teaches you throughout your career about cyber. So it's come in, it's a little bit like AI in some respects in recent years. It's come in a bit left field, as we said, 10, 15 years ago. It's an add-on. I think many exec members are non-technical. They're not expected to be. They're finance people, they're marketing people. Yeah. And therefore it's a whole nother dimension of stuff, which is, to a degree, there is a bit of a club to cyber people. They know a lot. They're very clever. They communicate well within themselves. They understand it implicitly, but it's not as established as a finance function or an HR function, and therefore it's seen as perhaps a little bit nuanced, a little bit
intimidating, perhaps.
Yeah, potentially, because it's not tangible either. AI is the next level on of intangibility, compared to cyber. But even cyber, it's not tangible. You can't see a risk. You can see a health and safety risk if if your scaffolding's not bolted together properly or whatever. You can't see cyber in the same sense. It's not as physical. And
Yeah.
therefore, people don't necessarily draw parallels from it. They can't necessarily understand it at the same speed they understand other things. And therefore, it probably falls down their to-do list. And because of that, you've got, as cyber people, we've got an uphill battle to get back in their mind space to understand that it's important.
Do you think that's one of the key things to being an effective cyber leader then, is overcoming that kind of reluctance, or kind of being able to kind of dismantle some of that,
Yeah.
how intimidating it can appear to them?
Yeah, we're going almost full circle back to the first point we chatted on, which is it's a translation mechanism. I simplified it potentially, but it is about being the person that has cyber responsibility at the board or as a board direct report has to probably spend as much. And I tried to do this but the shortcut way, and as in just force it in on times, and it's failed. Unless you are TalkTalk or currently M&S Co-op or Harrods, where you can guess what, it's going to be on their board agenda more than anything else, probably.
They're probably also having more board meetings in 3 weeks than they have done in the last 3 months, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's, it will feature heavily in those organisations at the moment, but the translation, the advocacy of getting cyber onto a board as a board member or as a -1 relies on an enormous amount of credibility building, not backing execs into a corner, unless absolutely necessary. Spending time with individuals, exec one by one, explaining it to them so they don't feel threatened by not understanding in a sort of group setting, and just keep gently going at it without becoming broken record. And if you get to a point where it's accepted as a thing, then you can start to weave it into the product roadmaps. Then you can start to do cyber by design and all the things that lead to it being less painful, as an afterthought. So, but that's a cultural shift, which takes support from, the human resources teams, the people teams, the finance teams need to back it. So it is a big board sell to even get everyone moving in the right direction, let alone individually bring a business case for something you need.
Yeah, gotcha. And I think that broader, it's really easy to say you need to collaborate, you need to work with others, but it is true, right? Security is a team sport, and you need everyone on board in order to truly succeed. And you need to get at least the majority of people on board if you're going to be taking those kind of cases. You need to have don't just develop something in isolation, get your 5-minute or your 15-minute window, and then expect that that's going to be your slam dunk kind of approval for your business case.
And one of the pieces of work I've done in recent years, the business was being valued on a number of dimensions for a later exit, later sale, and the valuation was, I call it chipped, reduced, was chipped on the basis of when the buyer was doing its due diligence, it found that there were some issues, not just on cyber, but in the context I was looking at it, there were cyber things that needed to be done. And the seller, the business that was selling, was therefore received less money at the point of the exit. So, and it was a lot of money. It wasn't like fractions of 1%. It was large single-digit percent numbers of the total valuation, because a number of things, including cyber, but a number of things had not been done even to basic standard. And so you, as the shareholders of the seller in that case, you're sitting there going, well, why have I been chipped by an enormous amount of money? Well, because the money, which would have been materially less in magnitude, wasn't put in the right way at the right time historically. And everyone was a bit grumbly about it, but at that point it's too late. So
I think I do quite a bit in the realm of kind of due diligence and kind of helping portfolio companies of investors kind of with their what would be kind of called value creation, and kind of helping to build and kind of defend value in the business. And I think sometimes people don't fully appreciate that if you've got let's say there's £1 million worth of cyber remediation work that needs to be done. When you come to sell your business, or to kind of, if you're looking to acquire a business, one of the things that you might do is look at that £1 million, go, what's the multiple that we're valuing this business at? And businesses are generally valued on a multiple of either their revenue or their EBIT, their kind of net profit. Especially if you're looking at it from a net profit perspective. Keeping the math simple, if you kind of go, well, he made £10 million worth of profit last year, but actually there was £1 million worth of ongoing cyber costs that weren't factored into that. Mm-hmm. Investors are going to look at that and go, well, you're not making £10 million profit, you're making £9 million profit. And that's not going to be a £1 million deduction. It's going to be times by whatever the multiple for the valuation of the business is, because they're no longer getting, say, 8 times £10 million worth of profit. They're getting 8 times £9 million worth of profit. So it's not a £1 million reduction. It's in that instance with an 8 times multiple, it's an £8 million reduction on the value of the business. So I think sometimes people miss that kind of that those sorts of things are what's going on in an investor's mind when it comes to kind of how they think about valuing businesses.
Yeah, I mean, and you're 100% on that. And the investor's job, the buyer's job, is to get the lowest price possible. The seller's job is to get the highest price possible. Well, back to the car metaphor, if you want to sell a car at top back, it's got to be in top order. And if you want to pay less, then you'll probably end up with a car, or in this case, an organisation that hasn't done everything it needs to do from its maintenance, general. So yeah, it's absolutely right. And I guess the extra that we're seeing, especially in the current M&S example, much the same as I guess true Co-op and Harrods, is that it's not just a valuation issue, stock price, etc. There is actually a brand damage. There's a customer confidence damage. They have got supply chain issues in the M&S sense. There's a whole load of ripple effects which suddenly come into play, which actually are less about pure valuation, but actually just about pure trading. Your trading stops or slows because of some of these things being realised that could have been fixed. So, it's a real tough. And this is why it is a board conversation, because it has so many levers and dimensions to it. It isn't one simple spend this, get that.
And I don't think either of us are saying that that's where a CISO needs to understand all of those different levers, because you're not the board, right? That is the reason to bring your piece of the puzzle, and they're going to have the other pieces there as well. You probably need to have a consideration of those different levers. But yeah, I think there's maybe a bit of a.
I'm not sure. So I think it depends on where you as a CISO sit. So I don't know the M&S setup. I don't know if the CISO is an exec member or a board member. He or she's probably an exec member, I would hope, at a business that size. I would hope that if you are a CISO of, say, a business like M&S, prior to the recent troubles they've had, I would hope that you are thinking a little bit around, well, it isn't just about data loss, it is about impact to trading. I remember...
Sorry, I didn't mean you don't need to worry or think about those at all, but what I meant is you don't need to have solved all of those problems before you go to the board.
Correct.
You need to be aware of and consider the full spectrum, but your job isn't to try and resolve all of those. Your job is to take your piece of the puzzle, and it's the board's job, the CEO's job, to balance the needs and the priorities of different teams and different businesses. That's what they're there to do, and to make those calls and trade-offs. And you may not like the outcome, the decision that they come to, but it's kind of your job to take the pieces of the puzzle and explain how you think they go together, make that case, be that advisor, and then take from there. Do you think there's especially when it comes to communication, how do you see the kind of CISO role evolving in the teams that you've worked with?
Yeah, I think, if I go back to the TalkTalk time, I think there was an influx, an acceleration of CISO roles. I think at the time, if you were a good, well-qualified, good communicator, experienced CISO, you could write your own comp agreement with the business. The blank checks were kind of there for some businesses. Everyone jumped a little bit. I get the distinct sense that's now softened. I think your previous point was, we were sort of touching on, what is CISO board role, or is it a -1, or isn't it a -1 to a -1? In some cases, it sits under a CTO, who might be a board direct report to CFO in some organisations. where does that sit in people's urgency and people's expectation? Is that CISO role still something they aspire to have close to the top of the business, or has it softened? I get the distinct sense that it's softened quite a lot, and it's become a bit more. Or the expectation is, well, cyber's been around a long time; it's business as usual, isn't it? Question mark. Unanswered question by some boards,
Yeah.
and I don't think it does go away. And we sort of briefly nudged into a couple of points on AI being part of the new cyber threat landscape. And I'm not sure we've solved cyber yet, let alone figure out how cyber and AI Venn diagram overlap and how that causes even more problems that we're not ready for. So, yeah, I don't think it should have fallen away as much as it might have appeared to. It'd be a really interesting stat. I don't have the answer, but it'd be a really interesting stat to look at the FTSE 350 and go, who's got a CISO on the exec board? Who's got a CISO as a -1 to an exec member? How often do they review risk as a board, specifically around cyber? I bet that the data would be actually quite worrying in terms of there'd be very few people dedicated. And that's the FTSE 350, so it's supposedly the biggest 350 companies in the UK listed. So, yeah.
I know from our point of view, where we've looked at some of the DCMS, the cyber breaches survey, the kind of annual government official national statistics, if you like, for cyber in the UK. I think it was around 75%, let's say 3 out of 4, give a bit of wiggle room. The board say that cybersecurity is a high priority, and less than a third of them have ever conducted a cyber risk assessment. So it's really important, but despite all the good practice and kind of industry guidance and things like that saying you should take a risk-based approach, you should understand how this might impact your business, many of them, not yet having actually conducted a risk assessment.
I mean, after we went through the TalkTalk experience together, at odd times in the last few years, it's sort of odd at moments when I think about how can we still be in a situation where big organisations are out of action materially for weeks, as we're seeing right now. You wouldn't get away in the UK as a listed company without having an annual report that had audited financials in it, for which you pay a lot of money on the big consulting organisations to audit your numbers. You probably wouldn't get away these days in a big organization without having the right level of reporting on your human and people related metrics, whatever those organizations choose to adopt. There's also a massive ESG, so the environmental side of that. That's also many, especially FTSE and big organizations, are having to report on. Yet there isn't the same for cyber. At no point does a big organization get audited on a 3 or 4 yearly cycle to make sure they've got the right level of things going on and they've got a plan. It doesn't happen, which is weird when you think about it.
I know that there was a consultation that closed a few months ago, I think, talking about board governance and cybersecurity and kind of, I think, with a view of trying to be a bit more prescriptive there about, particularly for, like you say, publicly listed businesses, what does good governance look like when it comes to cybersecurity? You'll sometimes see it in an annual report where there's a single, there are, what are the key risks to the business, and you'll see cyber and data often lumped together as one thing. On one hand saying, if we don't exploit data, then we're not going to be competitive in the marketplace, and on the flip side saying, but we might lose it all tomorrow, and that would be bad, obviously. But we're doing the right things, to kind of paraphrase. So. Not much nuance in there, despite the perhaps way more nuanced conversations that I'm sure are happening behind closed doors. Phil, is there anything else that you think that when it comes to that kind of storytelling and translation, any other kind of final tips or kind of areas where you think folks should be investing some time and trying to keep ahead of
I think if I draw a quick parallel between, I was at a AI conference a few weeks ago in London, and one of the sessions was given by 4 children. I mean, fair play to them, these 8 to 10-year-olds.
Right, yeah.
And they stood up in front of best part of hundreds, maybe even pushing 1,000 people, and gave their view on AI. And one of the things they were very clear on, one of the messages I took from the session listening to them, and children give simple, straightforward messages. They don't use convoluted language or complex or thoughts or models, was how can you? This was the sort of rhetorical question to the conference. How can you teach us, and how can you expect us to learn about the best ways to use AI ethically and safely as we grow up, if our teachers don't understand it and our parents don't understand it? Which is a great question. Because where are they going to go to learn other than from themselves or online, which is fraught with great danger? If you draw the parallel between that and cyber, and you start to think about, probably kids are a bit more cyber aware than we might have been when we were kids, because it wasn't such a thing. But should you, the society, start to build in cyber awareness in the current school population and maybe early career people? So on the basis that when they do get to be execs in a decade or two, then they're actually, it's just in their blood to think about it, talk about it, accept it. It's not an add-on, it's not a bolt-on.
Yeah.
Can you start to change culture a little bit that way? Now, it takes time. It's a decade or two in the making. But if you don't do it, what's going to happen to UK PLC as such in the future, when the organisations that we have grown up with are, on their knees for weeks trying to recover from a cyber attack? So I think there is a societal, cultural set of thoughts that needs to go on, which is nothing to do with being a FTSE board member. So, and we need to attack it at all angles. And I think that's the only thing I'm seeing, and struck me from that conference with those 4 children, that it's like, well, this applies to cyber as well. This isn't just about AI. And we've, so yeah, that's my thought.
That's that long-term solution, like you say, not going to be something that changes overnight, but definitely can see where that would be valuable. Yeah, as you say, in the long term, and perhaps a good point on that grand idea to wrap things up. A big thank you to Phil for sharing not just the big wins, but the hard-earned lessons that come along with leading complex change in our modern world. If this sparked an idea, challenged your thinking, or gave you some practical takeaways, please subscribe and share this with your friends or colleagues. And let's keep the conversation going. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment down below or get in touch on LinkedIn. Phil, thank you ever so much. That's it for this episode of Communicating Cyber. Until next time, thank you very much.
Thank you, Robin.